On September 10, 1955, CBS premiered a television show that would run continuously for 20 years and become one of the most iconic and longest-running dramatic series in American television history. The show was called Gunsmoke. It was set in Dodge City, Kansas, during the era of the Old West. It followed a lawman named Matt Dillon and the people who inhabited the world around him. For 2 decades, Americans tuned in to watch the Marshal of Dodge City maintain order in a frontier town that was equal parts dangerous, colorful, and deeply human. Show aired 635 episodes. It became a cultural phenomenon. It made stars out of actors and gave millions of people a weekly escape to the American frontier. But today, in 2026, 51 years after Gunsmoke aired its final episode in March of 1975, the cast is almost entirely gone. 8 main cast members who carried the show through its 20-year run, only one remains alive. His name is Buck Taylor, 88 years old. He lives on a ranch near Fort Worth, Texas, where he paints watercolors of the American West. He is the last living person who walked those soundstage streets of Dodge City as a principal cast member. This is the story of Gunsmoke's cast. It is a story of the American West, of fame and struggle, of tragedy and triumph, and of the real people behind the iconic characters that defined an era of television. The star of Gunsmoke was James Arnes, a man who stood 6 feet 7 inches tall without shoes. James Arnes was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was an enormous man with a distinctive presence that commanded attention simply by being in a room. When CBS went looking for an actor to play U.S. Marshal Matt Dillon in 1955, they approached John Wayne first. John Wayne turned down the role, but he recommended his friend Jim Arnes. CBS listened, cast Arnes in the role, and from that moment on, James Arnes would hold that Marshal's badge for the next 20 unbroken years across 635 episodes, the longest dramatic series lead tenure in American television history until 2010. What most viewers never knew was that James Arnes was a war hero. On February 1, 1944, 20-year-old rifleman with the 7th Infantry Regiment was ordered off a landing craft at Anzio Beach in Italy. Was the first man to jump because he was the tallest in the boat and could gauge the depth of the water. A German machine gun position opened fire. Bullets shattered his right leg before dawn. He spent the rest of that year in evacuation hospitals across Italy, Iowa, and Colorado. Came home with the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star, but his leg never fully healed. For the next 20 years, as he walked down the streets of Dodge City, viewers could sometimes notice a slight limp. That limp was real. Arnes carried German machine gun fragments in his right leg for 2 decades while playing America's greatest lawman. He never once let on that he was in pain. His personal life carried a grief he refused to discuss publicly. His daughter Jenny Lee died of a drug overdose in 1975 at age 24, just weeks before Gunsmoke went off the air. First wife Virginia followed her by the same cause just 2 years later in 1977. His adopted son Craig, a National Geographic photographer, died of West Nile virus complications in 2004. James Arnes endured tremendous loss, but he carried it silently. His second marriage to Janet Cerise lasted 33 years and held strong until his final mourning. On June 3, 2011, James Arnes died in his sleep of natural causes at his home in Brentwood, California. He was 88 years old. Years before his death, he had written a farewell letter for his website and asked that it run the day he passed. It thanked his fans and named the projects he loved. Today, rests in the Great Mausoleum at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, in a crypt marked with his name. Matt Dillon was the man Dodge City could lean against. James Arnes carried a leg full of German machine gun fragments under that badge for 2 decades and never once let on. Number 2 was the woman who held the entire room without ever having to speak loudly. Amanda Blake played Miss Kitty Russell, proprietor of the Long Branch Saloon. She was born Beverly Louise Neal in Buffalo, New York in 1929. She was the only child of a banker. In the late 1940s, she was working as a telephone operator in Claremont, California when MGM signed her and tried to package her as the next Greer Garson. The studio gave up on that comparison and let her go. By the time the Gunsmoke producers cast her as the red-headed saloon keeper who would become one of the most quietly powerful women on American television, she was 26 years old. Miss Kitty ran a room full of armed men without ever asking permission. Her unspoken love for Matt Dillon, never named or consummated on screen, became one of the great unfinished American romances. She carried the entire relationship in the way she looked at him when he walked through the door. Amanda Blake married 5 times and never had children. Her 4th husband, Frank Gilbert, was the partner of her life. Together on a Phoenix ranch, ran one of the first programs in the world to breed cheetahs in captivity, raising 7 generations on their land. 5th marriage to Austin City Councilman Mark Edward Spieth in 1984 ended tragically just 10 months later when Spieth died of AIDS-related pneumonia in 1985. What most people never knew was that in 1961, Blake sold her residual rights to Gunsmoke for a flat $100,000. Single transaction. That decision haunted her for the rest of her life as the show ran in syndication for the next 6 decades, generating millions of dollars in revenue. She walked away from the series after season 19 in 1974, exhausted by the commute from Phoenix and at odds with producer John Mantley over wardrobe and dialogue. After Gunsmoke, the rest of her time went to animals. She co-founded the Performing Animal Welfare Society and helped build the largest no-kill shelter in Arizona. Amanda Blake died at Mercy General Hospital in Sacramento on August 16, 1989 at age 60. Her physician publicly named the cause as AIDS-related complications, contradicting initial family reports of throat cancer. She was cremated, and at her request, ABC News wildlife correspondent Roger Karras carried her ashes to a game preserve in Kenya and scattered them there. Kitty was the woman who held the room. Amanda Blake spent her last 15 years trying to save wild cats. She asked to be carried to Africa when it was over. Number 3 barely spoke a line in any given episode, and yet the audience would recognize his face anywhere. Glenn Strange stood behind the bar of the Long Branch for 12 years, 6 feet 5 inches tall, mostly polishing the same glass while Miss Kitty ran the floor. He was born George Glenn Strange in Weed, New Mexico in August of 1899, 13 years before New Mexico was even a state. He spent his 20s as a deputy sheriff, a rodeo bronco rider, and a country band fiddler before drifting into Hollywood in the early 1930s as a stuntman in B-westerns. 2 decades of playing outlaws and henchmen in hundreds of films followed before the call that changed everything came from Universal in 1944. Boris Karloff had walked away from the Frankenstein makeup. Strange replaced him and was coached personally by Karloff in after-hours sessions. He played the monster 3 times: House of Frankenstein in 1944, House of Dracula in 1945, and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein in 1948. His face is the one on every Halloween mask of the monster ever sold. In 1969, New York Times mistakenly ran Karloff's obituary with a photograph of Strange in the makeup. Lung cancer arrived in 1972. Glenn Strange kept reporting to the Gunsmoke soundstage as long as his strength held. In July of 1973, attended the funeral of his close friend Lon Chaney Jr. and spoke at the service while seriously ill himself. 2 months later, on September 20, 1973, he died of lung cancer in Los Angeles at age 74. 5 episodes of Gunsmoke that he had already filmed aired after his death. Singer Eddie Dean sang at his funeral. Glenn Strange was the actor whose face has scared more children than any other in American film history. He stands today at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills. Number 4 was on the Gunsmoke call sheet for all 604 episodes he could physically reach, missing only 7 across 20 seasons after open-heart surgery in 1971. Milbour Stone was born in Burton, Kansas, town of fewer than 1,000 people, on July 5, 1904. He grew up watching the actual town doctor, Joseph Wakefield Myers, house calls in a horse-drawn buggy. Doc Adams, the country physician he would play for 2 decades on television, was a direct portrait of that man. Stone turned down a congressional appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy at age 18 to join a traveling repertory company. He worked vaudeville as half of a song and dance act called Stone and Strain. Did a turn on Broadway in 1934 and arrived in Hollywood in 1935. The next 20 years went to uncredited bit parts in over 150 films. Stone was 51 years old when CBS finally gave him the role that would define his life. Doc Adams had a sharp tongue, a soft heart, conscience of Dodge City. When he snapped at Festus over a glass of beer, the audience understood it as love. Silence from Doc meant somebody was dying. Stone took the role so seriously that he once stormed off the soundstage after arguing with a young producer who wanted to compromise a scene, reportedly yelling, "I am too old to scare and too rich to care." Won the Emmy for Outstanding Supporting Actor in 1968. In 1961, like Amanda Blake, had sold his residual rights to CBS for $100,000 and regretted it the rest of his life. His first wife, Ellen, died in 1937. 2 years later, he married Jane Garrison, and that marriage held for 41 years until his last mourning. He had 1 daughter, Shirley, and 4 grandchildren. After Gunsmoke ended in 1975, he retired completely and moved to a ranch in Rancho Santa Fe, fished, and built furniture for the house. Milbour Stone died of heart failure at Scripps Memorial Hospital in La Jolla on June 12, 1980 at age 75. He rests at El Camino Memorial Park in San Diego. Doc Adams was the country physician who never turned a patient away. Milbour Stone spent 51 years and 150 uncredited bit parts before anyone called his name. Number 5 is a name no one expected to find on a Gunsmoke list, and yet he was there for 3 full seasons before he was anybody. Burt Reynolds was 26 years old in 1962 when CBS cast him as Quint Asper, half Comanche blacksmith who became the closest thing the show ever ran to a leading man understudy. He stayed until 1965. Dodge City Soundstage is where he learned to be on camera for long stretches without doing anything. He was born in Lansing, Michigan in February of 1936 and raised in Riviera Beach, Florida, where his father was the town's chief of police. A football scholarship took him to Florida State University, where he was a standout halfback until a car accident and a knee injury ended that career in one summer. After Gunsmoke, he spent the next 7 years in films he would later say embarrassed him. Deliverance rescued him in 1972. Came The Longest Yard, Smokey and the Bandit, Hooper, and Starting Over. By the late 1970s, Burt Reynolds was the highest-paid actor in Hollywood for 5 consecutive years. The lead in Die Hard, the role of James Bond, and the part of Han Solo in Star Wars all came to him during that stretch, and he turned every one of them down. He admitted in his memoir that the Star Wars decision haunted him. He married Judy Kay in 1963 during his Gunsmoke years and divorced her 2 years later. His long romance with Sally Field through the late 1970s, he later called the great love of his life, one he regretted ending. Marriage to Lonnie Anderson in 1988 produced an adopted son named Quentin, and ended in 1993 in one of the ugliest public divorces of the decade. He never married again. His Oscar nomination for Boogie Nights came in 1997. Burt Reynolds died of cardiac arrest at Jupiter Medical Center in Florida on September 6, 2018 at age 82. His cremated remains sat in a family member's possession for 2.5 years, while relatives quarreled over where to put him. He was finally interred at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in the Garden of Legends section near the lake on February 11, 2021, on what would have been his 85th birthday. Quint Asper was the blacksmith of Dodge City. Burt Reynolds became the highest-paid movie star in America 15 years later, and he learned to act standing at that anvil. Number 6 left Gunsmoke voluntarily in 1964 because he was afraid the role was going to swallow him whole. Dennis Weaver had spent 9 years as Chester Goode, the limping, slow-talking deputy who hovered behind Matt Dillon with a loyalty that read on screen as devotion. He won the Emmy for Best Supporting Actor in 1959, partly on the strength of a limp he had invented in his audition and was stuck for the rest of the run. He was born in Joplin, Missouri in June of 1924. He served as a U.S. pilot in the Second World War and came home to graduate from the University of Oklahoma with a degree in fine arts. The same year he graduated, 1948, he competed in the U.S. Olympic decathlon trials and finished high enough to be one of the alternates for the London Games. After Gunsmoke, starred in 8 more series, anchored McCloud on NBC from 1970 to 1977, and delivered a career-defining performance in Steven Spielberg's first feature, the 1971 television movie Duel. From 1973 to 1975, served as president of the Screen Actors Guild. He married his childhood sweetheart Jerry Stell in 1945 and stayed married to her for 61 years until his last mourning. They had 3 sons. In 1993, the couple moved into a 10,000-square-foot solar-powered house in Ridgway, Colorado, built from recycled tires and 300,000 aluminum cans, which they called River Sage. Dennis Weaver died at home of cancer complications on February 24, 2006 at age 81. He was cremated, and his ashes were given to his family. 60-acre wildlife reserve named Dennis Weaver Memorial Park sits along the Uncompahgre River corridor in Ridgway, dedicated to his memory. Chester Goode walked with a limp for 9 seasons. Dennis Weaver was the Olympic decathlon alternate who built his last house out of garbage and made sure the garbage man could not tell where the house ended. Number 7 is the actor who played the most enduring deputy in Gunsmoke history and hid every interesting thing about himself behind a nasal, mountain accent. Ken Curtis was born Curtis Wayne Gates in Lamar, Colorado in July of 1916. His father was the sheriff of Bent County. Ken grew up in the apartment above the town jail, where his mother cooked meals for the prisoners. Attended Colorado College on a pre-med track and dropped out in 1938 to sing. NBC Radio hired him as a tenor, and in 1941 he joined the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra as the band's vocalist, taking the chair Frank Sinatra had recently vacated. Army service in Italy from 1943 to 1945 came next, and he came home with the Bronze Star. Most of the following decade went to singing with the Western vocal group the Sons of the Pioneers. In 1952, he married Barbara Ford, only daughter of director John Ford. The marriage lasted until 1964 and earned him supporting roles in some of his father-in-law's biggest films, including The Quiet Man, The Searchers, The Wings of Eagles, and The Alamo. Festus Haggen debuted on Gunsmoke in 1962 and joined the regular cast in 1964. Curtis based the character on a real man from his childhood, a fence post cutter named Cedar Jack, who used to end up drunk in his father's jail. The voice was an invention. His actual singing voice was a clear, smooth tenor. The Festus rasp was something he applied to himself every morning for 11 years. He married Tori Connolly in 1966 and stayed married to her for the rest of his life. His last role was the aging rancher Seaber Tate in the 1991 TNT film Connor opposite Sam Elliott with his old Gunsmoke partner Buck Taylor cast as the bad man. Ken Curtis died in his sleep of a heart attack at his home in Fresno, California on April 28, 1991 at age 74. Had attended a rodeo the night before in apparent good health. Tori, his wife, found him when she woke. The cremation followed quickly, and his ashes were scattered across the Colorado flatlands of his childhood. A bronze statue of him as Festus stands today in Clovis, California. Festus Haggen could not read a newspaper. Ken Curtis was the trained tenor who took Frank Sinatra's seat in the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra and married John Ford's only daughter. Number 8 is the only voice in this entire cast list still answering the phone. Buck Taylor was 29 years old when he joined Gunsmoke in 1967 as Newly O'Brien, a young gunsmith who arrived in Dodge City and eventually became a deputy marshal. He stayed for the final 8 seasons and 173 episodes. Walter Clarence Taylor III was born in Hollywood in May of 1938, son of character actor Dub Taylor. As of 2026, he is 88 years old. Buck was a competitive gymnast good enough to be sponsored to the 1960 U.S. Olympic trials in Rome. He failed to qualify. Theater study at USC and watercolor training at the Chouinard Art Institute came next, along with 2 years in the U.S. Navy before he turned to acting full-time. Milbour Stone and Ken Curtis took him aside in his first weeks on the Gunsmoke set and gave him the advice. Shaped his life. Respect the audience and never refuse a fan a moment of your time. He has lived by it for nearly 60 years. 2 of his sons carry the names of his Gunsmoke co-stars, Matthew for James Arnes and Cooper Glenn for Glenn Strange. Delivered the eulogy at James Arnes' funeral in June of 2011. Roles in Tombstone, Gettysburg, Cowboys, and Aliens, Hell or High Water followed across the next 4 decades. His recurring turn on Yellowstone as the rancher Emmett Walsh ended in 2022 with one of the most quietly devastating death scenes that series ever wrote. Buck Taylor is the last principal cast member of Gunsmoke still alive. Lives on a ranch near Fort Worth, Texas with his second wife, paints watercolors of the American West, creates the annual poster for the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo. On December 18, 2025, Roger Ewing, actor who briefly played Deputy Thad Greenwood before Newly O'Brien arrived to replace him, died in Morro Bay, California at age 83. Mourning, Buck Taylor became the sole surviving main cast member of Gunsmoke. Newly O'Brien was the youngest face in the Dodge City Marshal's office. Buck Taylor is now the last face left, still painting the country his co-stars rode through, still keeping a promise he made to 2 dying men in 1967. Streets of Dodge City were written on a soundstage. Today, the cast itself is scattered from a Glendale mausoleum to a Kenyan game preserve to Gunsmoke ran for 20 years. It produced 635 episodes. It made stars, ended careers, changed lives, told stories of justice and compassion that have never grown old. But behind the badge and behind the bar and behind the saloon door stood real people with real struggles. They carried war wounds and addictions and heartbreak and loss. And yet they came to work. They delivered their lines, walked those soundstage streets and made America believe in Dodge City. And now, 51 years after the final episode aired, only Buck Taylor remains to remember them. Do you remember watching Gunsmoke for the first time? Do you remember which character meant the most to you? Do you remember the final episode? Comment below and share your memories of this legendary show. The cast of Gunsmoke changed television forever. Even though most of them are gone, the legacy they created endures.